Friends, good morning and welcome to the second day of learning hosted by the Presbyterian Foundation. My name is Joseph Moore and I am a PCUSA pastor and one of your ministry relations officers at the Presbyterian Foundation. I want to welcome you on behalf of the trustees and staff of the foundation. We are so grateful that you're joining us this morning and today for this event. Our theme today centers around the topic of church property, but it's a conversation that I want to suggest must always be rooted in hope. So it seems fitting to open with a prayer for hope. This prayer comes to us from the old 1946 Book of Common Worship. Let us pray. O God of hope, fill your children with all joy and peace in believing, that in this world of mystery, we be not cast down nor dismayed, but may abound in hope in the power of the Holy Spirit. And grant that, laying hold of the hope set before us, it may be to us an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, entering into that which is within the veil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Few of us entered ministry to learn the ins and outs of property titles and transaction fees and environmental reviews. Yet many of us serve as pastors and church leaders in places where issues around property seem to suck up all the air in the room. Some are wondering whether or not they should expand their buildings. Others of us aren't sure how long we can carry on in buildings that feel like they've outgrown the congregation. Our hope is that today will provide a framework for you and your churches as you consider just what the Spirit might have in store for your particular congregations. What options do you have? What questions need to be answered at what point along a process? I also hope that today you will be reminded that you do not have to do this work alone. The Presbyterian Foundation, as a vibrant part of the PCUSA, is here to partner and to walk with you. You are not alone. If you remember nothing else today, I hope you remember that. Today we have 3 workshops. Our 11:30 Eastern, 8:30 Pacific workshop is hosted by Maggie Harmon. Maggie will help examine the role of mission and vision and values as you manage your property. At 2 o'clock Eastern and 11 o'clock Pacific, we'll come back for a workshop led by Olanda Carr and Robert Hay as they share what sorts of things you might consider as you look at property use, reuse, and various types of partnerships. What options do we see most often on the table as churches think about these things? Finally, at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, Paul Greer will lead a workshop helping us to understand finance as it relates to church property. You'll note that the presentations will move from seeking to explore the question of why to what, finally to the how of all of this. These are 3 different but equally important workshops for you to consider as you look at your own context. All 3 workshops will be recorded with the links to be sent out next Tuesday. Anyone who registered will receive the link a week from today. We're using the webinar version of Zoom, and seeing as we have almost 500 people registered for this day of learning, the chat function has been disabled, but you are encouraged to please use the Q&A button to submit any questions that you would like our presenters to answer. Each presentation, including questions, will run between 60 and 90 minutes. So please don't hesitate to submit questions. And if we can't get to all of them, we'll do our best to have the presenters submit written responses to the ones we can't get to today. Again, you'll use the Q&A button, not the chat, to submit questions for our presenters. Thank you again for joining us today. With those logistical notes, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Maggie Harmon to share with us this morning.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm so glad to be with you all and to have the opportunity to present. Get my screen shared. Well, we have a little technical issue, but I am sure that Nathan will get, our host Nathan will get screen sharing available in just a second. So I'll be able to share my screen. And there we go. It's Zoom, so you know, we always expect a few little glitches, and I will rely on our hosts Nathan and Joseph, who's our moderator for the day. If there are any, if I'm getting laggy or there's any issues with my internet, I'm sure one of them will flag it to me, and I will make sure that I change network so that nothing interferes. We're going to start, as Joseph said today, talking about vision and purpose, thinking about how that impacts what we do with our property. Because as we know, property does not exist by itself as something that isn't part of how we do our church mission, how we live out our purpose as people of faith. And what I really want to do is take the opportunity to think about how we understand that piece of our asset pool in being a reflection of what's important to us about how we carry out that mission. So we're going to start by really talking about some of the more esoteric pieces of how we get to what our mission or purpose is. And then what I'd like to do with this workshop is take you through the exercises that I usually use when I'm facilitating a workshop at a church or with a presbytery to think about how to get to what your purpose is. And my goal in doing that is to give you the tools and the resources that you can take back to your own church to do this work so that you can help directly with more understanding of how to align purpose and mission and assets. The ministry relations officers from the foundation are always available to facilitate and to be a partner with you in doing this work. But I do want to give you some tools today. And so that's really what I'm going to do, is sort of train the trainers through this workshop with some of these tools. And of course, you will have access to the recording and access to these slides, so you can use them however works best for you. With that, let's jump in. To make sure I'm on the right screen so that I can do that. There we go. So how does this all fit together? How do we start this process in thinking about what is our purpose and how does that impact what we do with our church property? We really need to start with values. The values are the foundational piece. And again, you know, we're going to talk more about this sort of esoteric components and then get to some of the more tactical pieces. And while I don't want to ironically devalue the purpose of values, what I do want to say is I know that values can be a little bit of that more challenging, again, esoteric sort of, I'm California, so I would say, you know, the squishy part of how we think about what our purpose is. But if you don't understand very clearly and distinctly what your values are, then it's very difficult to align your values and your purpose and then the actual missional functionality of what you're doing in your church. So we want to start by thinking about values, and we'll do some work around this that can help clarify what exactly our values are in very distinct ways. From there, what we want to do is take a look at core purpose, and core purpose, not as a goal, not as a tactical operation that we can do, but is that thing that's on the horizon that we're always moving toward. So you're going to see how these things stack together. Finally, we'll come to understanding mission. And understanding mission does become that tactical expression of what our purpose is. And our purpose, of course, then is again informed by what our values are. So we're going to build these three things to understand more effectively whether or not we're aligning what we're doing with our property to what our purpose is, and if it's effectively being aligned in a way where we can actually realize our mission through the work that we're doing with those assets. Let's jump right in here in talking about values and how we go about identifying values for the individual and for the organization. What do I mean here? It's important to remember, especially in a church body or a corporate body of any kind, and I've done a lot of this kind of work with for-profit corporations. It's really not a whole lot different when we're talking about a church body. We want to understand that there's a distinction between who I am as a member of the church and who the church is. And I'm talking now about church writ large, right? Because who I am is a part of who fits into the church, but the church should not be a reflection of everything that I am and that I value, right? I need to understand how I can do good work in the church, how I fit as a piece of that, how I can understand other people fit as a piece of that, but it's those distinct pieces together that make the body that is the church. And sometimes with values, we can feel some tension between what I want and what I think the organization should be doing. But if we do the work to identify our personal values first, and we do the work to identify the corporate, the organizational values, then we can see how we fit in, but also how we're distinct and why it's okay for there to be those distinctions, right? The church should not be everything to everyone. And we need to be able to understand that sometimes things that are important to us might not be happening there, even as we understand how we can be an important part of what is happening there. And I know that this is, as I'm saying it out loud, it sounds a little strange to me, but let's get into some examples. So the questions to ask are, what behaviors do you bring to your interactions? And what are your guiding principles that without justification are important to you? That's different and distinct than the enduring tenets of an organization itself, right? Because it's going to be living behaviorally based on that. And those are the guiding principles that function the operation, right? So we may fit into, but we are not defining necessarily because we're just one individual. And really, the church body is made up of a lot of individuals who are going to be coming with different perspectives. So how do you do this values work? This is an exercise that I was introduced to, I think, about maybe 16 years ago now, that was actually being led by a rabbi who had done some work with a number of organizational behavioral scientists who surveyed people across the world. And what they did was they came back and they said, here are 26 values that are fairly universal in terms of how people experience what motivates them in their interactions. These are not perfect, but these are pretty good. And so the exercise is to take a look at these values, look at the word, and then look at the definition that's offered here of that word. I mean, it's very easy to look at the word and say, well, when I think of obligation, I think of it differently than committing to fulfill a duty or promise. But the exercise, and what's important about this exercise, is looking at the definition that's being offered here, because that's really the substance of what we're trying to get at. So looking at that, and then asking yourself, what are the 3 to 5 values here that motivate me as an individual? And these will change over the course of your lifetime, because different things are different for you as you grow and change and evolve and have different experiences. So don't feel like when you're picking something, what you're doing is you're rejecting something else, or you're saying, this is who I'm going to be for every single day that I'm here on this planet. So what you want to do is you want to pick 3 to 5, no more than 5, ideally 3. And again, not picking something is not the same thing as rejecting it, but understanding for yourself what it is that motivates you and that drives your behaviors most of the time. These are your core values, right? So once you've done that, and doing this in a workshop with a church, one of the things that's nice to do is actually write these down on sticky notes, have everyone in the room do them individually, write them down on sticky notes, and then take those notes and put them up on a big board. Group the ones that are common, but see where there are commonalities between people, because of course there will be in a church, but then also see where there are differences, because those are differences that can be strengths that you call on for people. Those are opportunities to ask people to stretch themselves. It will give you a glimpse of probably what motivates the values of the church, but it will importantly tell you, who am I and where do I fit into this broader organization? Once you've done that, you've had that chance to do that as an individual, what's nice is to then do that for the church, right? Not looking at your own values, but saying, well, what does this church really operate on? And then select again, 3 to 5, thinking about the church body, and do the same exercise. Go ahead and write those on sticky notes and then put those up, group the commonalities, and you'll see where the church body generally thinks that the church is going. The reason that it's important to do your individual values first is so that you can clean that up for yourself, so that you're not then imposing who you are on the church organization itself, but you can see where those distinctions are. And this is really important in thinking about sometimes what is best for this organization as distinct from what do I want for this organization. I hope that that makes sense. I'm guessing if it doesn't, we'll get some questions. So moving on from values, once you've had a chance to identify your values, what I want to do is talk about how those might look once you actually express them, right? Because you don't, let me just jump back here real quick. You don't generally say, here are the values of the church: family, equality, competence, right? If that's what those are, you're going to express those in some way that becomes reflective of behaviors that you want to see. We've not reached core purpose yet, but we're thinking about values, right? So how does that look in a corporate setting? You probably saw Zappos up here. This is a little dated. I know Zappos is a little bit old as a company at this point, and they've been acquired. But when they first started out, when you would order from Zappos, you would get a box, and it would have one of their core values on the box, which I thought was a really interesting way for them to express it externally and tell people this is what matters to us. But it was also an interesting way for them to remind themselves of what those are, right? So their core values got expressed in these phrases, right? Embrace and drive change, which they did. Be adventurous, creative, and open-minded. Do more with less. When they started, they certainly were. Be passionate, determined, be humble. Deliver wow through service. They were one of the first companies that was order everything you want, return whatever you want, get it the next day. however we feel about the impact of that on the world, what they were doing, and I think what's important about looking at these is understanding that they understood what was driving them, and they expressed it through these behaviors. And it was an expression of values that they then shared with the world. Let me give you another one, a contrast. We have Facebook, who has once again been in the news lately for perhaps moving fast, being bold, and unfortunately, perhaps focusing on impact rather than on people. So again, I think I've given away a little bit of how I feel about Facebook, but these are expressions of what was important to them at a time. This may or may not still be the case, but you can see through their behavior how they actually did these things. So let's move now from the profane to the sacred and say, okay, so what are the values that we live? How do those get expressed in phrases, right? And in behaviors that we might be engaged in? Well, one of our values is loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. How do we do that? How does that value of love get expressed? Feeding, quenching thirst, welcoming, clothing. So these are values, but they're also value expressions that you can see in behavior. So you can see whether or not someone's actually aligning what they say is important to them to what they do. So if you say one of your values is loving neighbor as self, but then you don't do these things, then you can see that there's a misalignment. And that's true for church organizations as well. But again, we want to say, well, what are my personal values? How do I live them? If I were to tell someone this is how I express them, is that actually what I do? And by doing those two pieces distinctly, it gives you the opportunity to see, again, where do I fit? Where can I serve? What might this church need to be doing a little bit differently, right? So once you've built that base of values, what we want to do is think about how that ladders up into defining a core purpose. So a core purpose, before we jump to that exercise, a core purpose is really that thing that lives out on the horizon that you're always going to be striving for. Well, how do you figure out what that is? The first thing I'd like to suggest is that you do a SWOT exercise. And a SWOT in business, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through a SWOT exercise that's designed for church organizations. It's short. It's something that you can do in an hour. If you have 2 hours and allow for more discussion, that's even better. But it's not a SWOT that requires that you have a facilitator come in and do a multi-day workshop with you and then come back with a big report. This was really built to get very tactical for churches that they can do very quickly to start to come to some understanding of what are we really good at? Are we really doing the things that we say we value? Or do we need to make some changes because we're really not so great in that place? It's a really good way of helping identify where should we focus, what do we need to let go of, and what might be getting in our way. So I want to take you through these questions. And again, you're going to have access to this so you can do this. It can be very helpful to have a facilitator come in and ask these questions, but also to help draw some of the conclusions around looking at this. And your ministry relations officers are available to do that with you. But you can do this yourself. You just have to be ready as a church organization to really challenge each other, and that's okay. So let's start. The first question, and it is important to go in order. It's also important to go one at a time. because otherwise people have a tendency to jump ahead and to answer the first questions by already thinking about and correcting for the last questions. So the first question to ask is always, why are you excited to be here? Why are you excited to be here at this church? What gets you excited and motivated about being here in this place at this time right now? From there, and you want to give a couple minutes for each of these, not a lot of time, maybe, anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes. And the reason you want to go fast is because you really don't want people to overthink it. Sometimes the first response that you have to a question is exactly what the right answer is. And all of these are emotional. They're not going to be measurable as right or wrong, right? The next question you ask is, what do you do exceptionally well? And the you here is the church, not the individual. What does the church do exceptionally well? And I know that this is a hard question because we're humble and we don't want to say, well, we're doing anything exceptionally well, because we're just here to serve. That's true. And when you're talking about purpose, when you're talking about answering the hard questions about aligning your purpose to your assets and the tools that you have available, you have to understand what you're very good at so that you can really focus on the things that you're very good at and maybe be willing to let go of the things that take a lot of time and energy, but you're less good at. So don't be afraid of saying, this is what our church does exceptionally well. And then you want to ask, what are your most valuable assets? And again, your here is the church. What are the most valuable assets of the church? It could be financial. It could be volunteerism. It could be something else entirely. But think about, what are the most valuable things that this church has? These are your strength questions. Then you're going to move on to weaknesses. Where does the church fall down? Where do you not do such a good job? Again, you've got to be honest here. And part of what you're doing in this exercise is everyone should be writing these down. Ideally, I've done a lot of work in consulting. And so I'm going to mention sticky notes over and over. Ideally, you're doing this on sticky notes because what you want to do at the end is get up and put all the sticky notes that are answering each question together so that then everyone can look at it and see, well, again, where do we have commonalities in what we're saying? Or do we have like vast differences, which may reveal we have a different issue that we need to create more alignment in the church. But if you can do this on a sticky, that's great. Where do you fall down? Where does the church not do a good job? And everyone wants to be honest here, because if you're not honest, then you don't have the ability to grow. The next question is, what are the biggest barriers to change? And this is a hard question, especially in the church, where a lot of times one of the things that's really important to us is tradition and how we've done things in the past. But answering the question, what are the biggest barriers to change? If we wanted to do something different, what gets in the way of us actually doing that? Again, this will reveal a lot about not only what you're not so good at, but what you are really good at, because it will tell you what that contrast is. Those are your weakness questions. Then we have an opportunity question. What could you do completely differently? When I work with churches, I always remind them when you're answering this, this can be huge. It can be an enormous change, or it can be something really small, but that you've been really hung up on exactly doing it exactly the same way for a long time. And in the church in particular, sometimes what you need when you're thinking about purpose is habit shifts, and habit shifts can be small. So when you're answering this, it's okay to think small, but you have to think different. And then finally, the threat question. What scares you, and it's a two-part question. What scares you the most today for the church? What scares you about the future for the church? And again, as you're answering these, what's going to happen is you're going to start to reveal where there are commonalities of this is an area where we're weak, and this is an area where I think we have some threat because it scares me about the future. What that might be able to do is tell you, gosh, maybe we should let go of that particular thing so that we can focus on the things where we're really strong and energetically be aligning ourselves to what we're already really good at and we have some energy around. That's the SWOT analysis. So then what do you do with that? Well, it's good information, right? It can help you make decisions and it can help inform what should we really be focused on. But then how do you get to that language of what should we really be focused on? So a core purpose, again, is not a goal. It's the thing that we're striving for. And that can be really hard to develop that language, right? So I want to give you some exercises that you can use for developing that language. Roger Schenck is a cognitive psychologist at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and he's done a lot of work in this area. And I think that probably some of you are familiar with what we're going to do because there's been a lot of talk about it lately. This quote's old, but the work hasn't changed and the impact hasn't changed. But he says humans are not ideally set up to understand logic. They are ideally set up to understand stories. And the example I like to give of this for people in church is always this. How many people who are listening, and I know we're not on a Zoom meeting, so I can't see everyone raise their hand, but how many people here can tell me, what's the most important thing that you got out of the book of Leviticus? And my guess is, well, I know that there's probably a lot of pastors on, so they might be able to answer this question. But for a lot of other people, the answer is not much, because it is not, I think it's a very exciting book. I'm an attorney. I like rules, but I don't, in general, that's not a book that people tend to go, oh yeah, I know exactly what's in Leviticus, because boy, is that a good read. No, but if I ask the same question and say, tell me what the most important thing is that you got out of Genesis, or what's the most interesting part for you of Genesis, a lot of people can answer that and can tell me stories about that. Why? Because Genesis is stories and Leviticus is lists of rules. I guess I could use Numbers as an even better example for that, except everyone does remember that Numbers is just a bunch of numbers. So what's important about that is remembering that what we're trying to do is live our values and live our impact through the emotionality of an ideal story that is motivating us to do more. And we want to do that in really short words. Why? Because when you start to tell stories that are really long and complex, one, people don't remember them, and two, it becomes very hard to attach to those emotionally. But you can tell a very short story with a lot of emotional impact quickly. Here are a few examples. I really do seem to have like something against Facebook, I guess, because I've got another example from Facebook in here, but they sort of make it easy. I do love this from Leonard Lopez show. Facebook has ruined my entire life. That's a story in 6 words. Each one of these examples provides you with an emotional experience of what's happening for someone here. And that's what we want to do with our purpose. We want our purpose to emotionally motivate us for that greater thing that we're working toward. And we want it to be something that is digestible and understandable quickly, so that there's not a lot of room for making it more complex, but also not understanding part of what we're trying to do and then losing focus on purpose. So what are some examples of a core purpose? It tends to be easier to find these in corporate settings. And so I'm going to give you some corporate examples just to give you an idea of how you go from that emotionality of a story to actually getting something that can motivate you in an organization. So we'll start with Fannie Mae. Their core purpose for a long time was to strengthen social fabric and democratize home ownership. Now, what happened in 2008 aside, I think we can look at this and say, this is it's emotional, making home ownership available to people, and they were doing this. There were other problems that happened, but we can see how this could be a motivating, emotional response that ideally encourages and excites people to get involved with what they're doing. After World War II, Sony wrote their core purpose as a joyful technology that benefits the public. Several years ago, I think at this point about 10 years ago, a new CEO came into Sony, and they had been kind of drifting and their market share was falling. And there was a great article that he wrote, or that he was interviewed in an article that was written about this in the Wall Street Journal. And he referenced the core purpose. And what he said was, we had moved away from it. We moved away from wanting to create joyful technology to benefit people. And we have to move back to that if we actually want to be a strong company that is doing what we know we can be good at. So that's also how you use a purpose as a gut check against, are we really doing what it is that we're called to do, right? Nissan recently changed their core purpose, and what they have now, I think, is fascinating. They say they're a technology company that moves people. They're not a car company, they're a technology company that moves people. Again, is this motivating? Does this feel emotional? Walt Disney says, our purpose, and this has been from the very beginning, to make people happy. So again, these are examples. I did this workshop, or a workshop that included some of these exercises for a church a few weeks ago. And afterwards, when we talked about the fact that sometimes it can be hard to find a core purpose for that is a short, succinct 6-word core purpose for nonprofits or churches, someone texted me and said, I found one. It's not quite 6 words, but it's close. And I think that we could get it to 6 words if we tried. But Fuller Theological Seminary, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, has this out there as a core purpose: indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. So I'm very grateful to the person who shared this with me. So now I can include a church purpose as well. So those are our core purpose examples. Great. What do you do with these, right? So this is what you're going to do, again, in facilitated workshop or just in work together. You're going to write 6-word stories. And the reason you're going to write 6-word stories is because it forces you to get the core of what's important, oftentimes value statements, and something actionable into something that is a small container that can then be used as that motivating language that can't necessarily, it's again, not a box you can check, but it's something that you can drive toward. How do you get to the core purpose of a church organization? You start with yourself again, because we have to understand how we are distinct from, we serve, but we are not by ourselves the church or defining who the church should be. So start with a 6-word story about yourself. Each one of these you get to spend about 2 minutes doing. And the goal actually is quantity. You want to write as many as you can. They don't have to be perfect. You don't have to share them all. They do have to be 6 words. Write a 6-word story about yourself and then invite people to share those. Then 2 more minutes. Write a 6-word story about the organization. This is now a story about the church. 2 minutes, write as many as you can. Everybody shares. Then you're going to write a 6-word story about the broader community in which the church sits. Why is this important? Because as churches, our job is to serve. We don't exist just for ourselves. We exist, as we saw in the values before, to do things for others. So we have to understand where we're sited and what it is that we're being called to do. And to do that, we have to understand and think about who our broader community is. So first yourself, then the church, then the community, and then sharing these. We're still not at a core purpose, but don't worry, we're going to get there. Because what you're going to do is that work, and what that work is going to reveal for you is, and I pause because this can be challenging. That work should reveal, as people are answering those questions, where it is the church actually is aligned, where you actually have opportunities to serve, and how you can do that service. And that's what you get to from all of that work of what are we good at in the SWOT, what are we excited about, what are the problems, and then going through that work of actually developing the purpose takes you to a place of saying, oh, this is what we're really good at, our strengths. And then this is what our community needs, because that's what we're hearing as we write these stories about our community. So we're going to pause now, and now we're going to think about mission, because you want to move from understanding that purpose, and you're going to have to bring those pieces together. It can be helpful to have someone help to facilitate to do that. And once you've brought those pieces together, then say, okay, how do we live this in a tactical way? And sometimes thinking about how do we live this in a tactical way can help inform what is the actual language of the purpose that we want to use. So while these things build on each other, they also don't exist without being connected to each other. So let's talk about mission now. One of the things that you want to understand is empathetically really who it is that are members and who it is that you're serving. So you want to ask the questions, who would you identify as a member? Now, in a sense, that's pretty easy because we have membership roles and people sign up to be members. But it's also worth asking the question, because in a lot of churches, we have a lot of people who are involved who are not officially members. But it's important to think about, how do we identify them? How do we think about them? How do we feel about them being involved in different ways? And I know that there are specific rules about certain service positions. But again, we want to ask the question, who is it that's a member of this community? What do we mean when we say member? And how do we maybe think about that in terms of what our service looks like? And then you want to ask the question, who would you identify as a potential member? Why does this matter? Because you want to understand who it is that you're actually engaging with to invite to be in whatever that member definition is, right? And this is going to be different. While again, we have a technical answer for what member is, we want to understand emotionally how we engage with that, so we can think about that in a way that is, well, who are we inviting into what that thing is for us? How do people feel connected? And then ask the question, and this is distinct, who do you identify as a participant? And for a lot of churches, that is someone who comes to worship. And my challenge in that is, are there other ways to participate in the life of the church? And do we need to expand how we think about who a participant in the church is in order to be more engaged with the people who are coming into contact with the work that we're doing? Why does this matter? Because this is going to help inform how you think about what your mission is, what you're motivated by as your purpose, and how you actually express the values that you've identified to the people that you're coming in contact with. So how do you define mission? Well, you do want it to be emotional, not unlike when we're talking about the core purpose statements. You want it to be meaningful, but here's where it's different. A purpose is actionable in the sense that it's something that you're moving toward and that you can check to see, is this thing that we're going to do aligned to our purpose? But a mission is different in that it has to be something that you can actually do right now, right? Not just am I moving in the direction of, but is this a thing that we can say we've done? This is where you start to develop missional goals. We did this thing, and we can check that box. So one of the things, before I conclude, one of the things that can be really important at this stage in thinking about mission, purpose, values, and then your assets, because I want to bring it back to thinking about our assets and what we do with them, is to understand in mission what it is we're doing that we can say we're trying to accomplish these things, and we're trying to accomplish them in a way that aligns to what we're really good at. So one of the exercises that you can use, again, in defining mission, is going back to that 6-word story and saying, you know, if we were to write goal statements for the next year for our church in 6-word stories, and we write those, then how do we go back and make sure that we have the right tools to do that with? So sometimes it can be really challenging to say, you know, we want to accomplish X, but we don't have any of the tools to do X. So how do we make sure that we have the right tools or the right assets to be able to do that thing? And writing those missional statements as goals, and you know, in brief statements, can allow you to start to see where you want to align. So that's a lot. This is my last slide here. So what I'm going to do is stop talking now, because I've talked at you a lot, and I know that this is a lot to then go back to your church and take and do. But what I would like to do is have some conversation with Joseph and see if there's questions I can answer, if there's more information that would be helpful in thinking about how you use these tools to really define who and how you are, and then to figure out whether or not you have the right asset mix or the right tools to enable you to do those things that you've decided are important to be able to do. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Maggie, thank you for your wisdom, for your presentation. Truly grateful for the things that you've teed up for. I know the conversation that's going to happen both here and hopefully beyond in churches around the country. We've had some great questions come in. One just kind of logistical question. A number of people have asked if the slides will be available after the presentation. Specifically, a number of people wanted the list of values that you shared.
Yes. Those will be available. All the slides will be available, and we will put those up on the page where you can access the videos. The values also, when I first did them, it can be easier to use them as, cut them up as cards, so that you actually have a tactile experience of like moving through them and thinking about them. So if you have the ability to do that, I would encourage you to.
Great. Someone asked regarding the SWOT analysis. They said, what if the answer to the O is nothing? We don't really want to do anything differently. And what if the answer to the T question is the fear that we will die? Mm-hmm. So those are sort of two different questions, but.
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, I would add to that. Sometimes I do this work with a church, and when we do the, what do you do exceptionally well? The answer is nothing. And I think that if we're being really honest, there are times when that's true. When we don't want to do anything differently, we're not doing anything, that's exceptional. And that's okay. I would suggest that there are times that there's a life cycle to church, right? There's a life cycle to us and to how we function. There's a life cycle to the church. And there are times when energetically you just don't have it. Like you just don't have what it would take to respond in a different way. What you need is that sort of comforting place that is familiar and easy. And I think that that's okay, but I think it's also important to identify that. And I personally believe that we are asked and called to be in a constant responsive dance around our spiritual development and growth. So if that's what you find when you do this for your church, I think the answer is, well, that's okay to be in that place. And as you're in that place and you need that for yourself, how can you take some of the gifts that you have, and this might become more of a stewardship conversation, how can you take the gifts that you've received and make sure that you are sharing them now, or ensuring that you're going to leave a legacy of this comfort that you've received for the people who come after you? It's never enough to say, I'm not doing anything else, because we're not, that's not what God's asking of us. I'm listening to a podcast right now, and the gentleman who's leading the podcast, Jim Finley with the Center for Action and Contemplation, said in an episode the other day, we all say we want to follow Christ, and then we see where he's headed toward that cross, and we're like, I don't know. But I think that that's the challenge. It's like, it's okay to know that that's what your truth is. And then where do you get a little uncomfortable? Because that's probably where you're being called to go.
The questions are rolling in, which is just fantastic. What are some of the most common fears? This is still related to the SWOT analysis. The most common fears that you hear in the work you do with churches?
That the church is going to close, and that people don't need church anymore.
Yeah. Do you have any examples that you can recall? This is putting you on the spot a little bit, of a particular church's 6-word story.
When we do that exercise, what tends to happen is, because you're in a room of individuals, and depending on the size of the church, really anywhere from 5 to, gosh, I've done it with 25 people. And so you get a lot of different stories about the organization. Typically what I do when I'm leading these, because you do want to have someone who's not participating, but who's leading it. What I do is I try to consolidate some of that. And if it's really disparate, then what I tend to do is to say, you all need to look at this for a while and sit with it and see what it's bringing up. Because sometimes you can't come up with one. That's a long answer to the question, and it's not actually an answer. The answer is no, I don't remember specific ones, because part of the goal of the exercise is not necessarily to say this is absolutely when it's going to be. And I think part of the challenge is to go back after you've done that and to find a way to come to comfortable agreement about this is what our purpose is going to be. So often I'm not done when I leave.
Yeah. Well, following up with that, someone asked, how do you proceed when participants are unable to describe the ministry or the community? This approach assumes that the participants understanding that the church is for service and spreading the good news to others. I think the gist of the question is there could be people in church that's actually not how they see church.
Yeah, but I think that that's really important to identify. And I will say, I sometimes find that when I work with churches. I worked with a church that was very small, and for them, their purpose was to have a place where they could come and be together one day a week and worship, and that was it. And if you go back and you think about, because sometimes what I'll do is I'll talk to folks about, that idea of the 6 great ends of the church, and creating a space for divine worship is one thing, and that's an important thing, and maybe that's the only thing you can do. If that's the only thing you can do, then the part of what we're talking about is property and assets. You've got to ask yourself if you are appropriately aligning the resources you have to the thing that you're doing. And I would suggest, and I have suggested, that while it is critically important to have a space for divine worship and to have sacred space, that sometimes you're misaligned if you have a campus that is prepared to serve 1,200 people, and what all you're able to do right now is offer worship for 25. It's okay to just be doing that, and if that's all you've got, but then let's ask the question about whether or not we're appropriately aligning the gifts we've been given.
Thanks. Someone asked, they said, please address how mission as described today in your presentation, how that is different from traditional mission committees within congregations.
I'm talking about mission here as like the larger goal for the organization, the thing that we're doing together. I would say mission committees tend to be more responsible for responding to a specific part of what we would think of as broader mission. And it can be hard because it's the same word, but what I'd like to do is sort of like ladder up those committees back to, what is the broader thing we as a church can now do? I see a lot of churches who, again, maybe there were 1,200 people or 2,500 people. And so there were, mission committee and a lot of different people doing, different missional activities. Well, today with 120 people, we still have all those different groups, but we're just not as effective anymore, because we're just not, we're not as big and we're stretched so thin. Doing mission and thinking about it in this way allows you to sort of consolidate that and answer the question, what are we really good at? Where should we really focus? And it's okay to say, we're going to let go of this thing and trust and have faith that someone else will pick that up. Maybe not our organization, but somebody else will. And we have to make room for God to do that work for someone else.
Someone else asked, should this work be done with just the session, Or could this be a cross-section of the entire church body?
You know, when I was working in corporate settings, you were very specific about who was there because you had the ability to do sort of top-down management and like do this work and then come out and say to everyone who works there, here's how it's going to be. That's not what we do in the church. And so I think it's critically important that you invite as many people as you can. Also because our sessions change, right? You're not going to have someone who is the CEO of the church. You should not have someone who is the CEO of the church. So I say when you do this work, invite session, your deacons, your committee leads, and then open it up and say anyone else who wants to come. Because what you don't want is to do this work, which is really, you know, good work for the church to do, and then have someone say, well, I'm part of the church, but I wasn't invited. So even if they don't come, that's okay, but at least you said, we want to hear from the whole church.
Yeah. Someone wrote, my congregation's average age is over 80. Every year we struggle to fill key roles as elders and deacons. Many in the congregation are facing health issues, and many do not share their struggles with one another. Responding to these needs would be a great mission. How do you encourage people to participate in the mission when many are not comfortable with being vulnerable?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, I would go back and I think that in that space there's some work for the pastors and elders who are willing there to do around reminding us who it is that we're following and what his vulnerability looked like. You know, if we really want to follow Christ, if we really want to be close to Christ, we have to be willing to open up our hearts and be vulnerable in the most profound way with each other so that we can receive that love. So I think that there's some spiritual work that would have to happen there before you can get to this.
Yeah. I think we have time for at least a couple more questions. Is that, you're good with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone raised the question of asking for an example of a mission statement, and it relates to another comment earlier. If we think of core purpose as being maybe a little more broad than mission, what questions do you ask a congregation to help move from that core purpose to a more specific mission? I think you used the term sort of think a year out or so, something that's measurable possibly. And do you have any specific examples of church mission statements, conversations that you have found helpful or at least worth remembering?
I don't have specific examples. You know, I think that sort of a general example I would say, or the distinction would be, if your core purpose is to your core purpose as a church is to ensure that all children are fed. And that's specific, but it's not something that's ever achievable, right? Because there's always going to be a child who's hungry, and as depressing as it is to know that, you know, we're reminded of that in Deuteronomy when we're told, you know, reach out your hand to the poor and the needy. There will always be poor and needy. So if we say all children, our purpose is to make sure that all children are fed, and fed can also be, you know, spiritually, with food, etc. Our mission might be, as a missional church, to be offering family meals 5 days a week. What is our mission? Our mission is to feed the families in our neighborhood. And so that's laddering up into your purpose. And what it's doing is it's something specific that you can say, are we actually doing this? Can we actually get to doing it? And then that again, that would align to, if you, depending on the kind of property you have, you say that that's what you want to do, but you don't have a kitchen and you don't have volunteers who could actually come and do that. That's a checkpoint to say, maybe that's not something we can do, or maybe this is a time when what we have to do is partner with another organization who can help us live what we know to be our purpose and our mission. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, I think it's, yeah, I think it speaks to it. I also think that the tie-in with our church buildings, I think is crucial for all of this, right? Like, it seems like you're making the argument that all these questions and conversations need to happen before we get to what do we do with the kitchen?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry I didn't make that more clear at the beginning. That was, one of those things that I think was in my brain and did not come out of my mouth. But absolutely, one of the things that we need to do is make sure we're doing this work first, because this is what gives us the direction to figure out where it is we want to go with the things that we have. It's a little bit like saying you want to go on vacation, and then someone saying to you like, okay, well, where are you going to go on vacation? Well, I could go backpacking, I could go camping, I could go on a cruise, you could do a million things. But if you don't do the work first to say, oh, I want a restorative vacation, or I want an adventure vacation, or I want an educational vacation, then you can't narrow to figure out what it is you're going to do. And you're just going to be endlessly talking about what the possibilities are.
Yeah. Someone just asked, how do you overcome the quote, that is the way we've always done it in such a changing environment?
Yeah. What I do is I always say, well, first of all, if there's a blessing from COVID, the answer is we've already learned how to not do it the way we always did it. So I don't really want to hear that anymore. But the other thing that I say to churches is, oh, okay. So we're part of a faith that is 2000 plus years old. How we're doing it is very different than how Jesus was doing it, but we're still following him. So we have not, in fact, always done it the same way. It has been changing and evolving. To say we've always done it that way is really to say, this is the way I like to do it. This is the way I know how to do it. And then again, I would say that's okay. And that's not how growth happens.
Yeah. I mean, your answer to that, combined with much, if not most, of what you've spoken about, ultimately goes back to, this is an exercise in truthfulness. Mm-hmm. In churches and institutions, developing a clear sense, being able to articulate who they are, mm-hmm. And with no judgment, right? Like, just this is who we are. And then you kind of create some wiggle room to begin to discern, well, this is maybe who we're called to be. But without that truth-telling aspect of the process that you're talking about, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I like to think about it in terms of, how Paul talked about the body of Christ in, I think, Corinthians, where, you need to know what you are, right? Like, I might be a great arm. I have to know that I'm an arm, because I can get confused sometimes and think that I should be, a leg or a foot or, an ear. But I have to do the work to find out, like, no, I'm an arm. And I want to be a really good arm. And exactly what you said, it's not about judgment of like, the eye is better than the arm. It's not. You need the whole thing, but know what you are, know what you're really good at, and then be excellent at that, and be willing to let go of the ego around the other things. And you can say that about, our church property too, which we're going to talk about. I know Robert and Olanda and Paul are going to talk about later. You know, and what you were really good at 40 years ago might have changed. So the things that you had that helped you be really good at that thing 40 years ago might not be helping you today, and in fact, maybe hindering you. So I think you're exactly right. It's just about being honest and then letting go of ego around, wanting to be that other thing.
Yeah. So are there any last words you'd say to a pastor or church leader, church treasurer who might need some encouragement to insist that this work happen before a session or a property committee engages in, some wild out there scheme for their property?
Yes, but I'm going to answer it spiritually. And I know that when we're talking about property, sometimes we want to talk about it, in terms of the sort of more secular. What I would say is, when you align yourself to what it is that God wants you to do, things just get a whole lot easier. It doesn't make your life easy, but it's like, doors open in a way that you weren't expecting them to open when you step into that river and say, okay, take me. And I think that sometimes we have a tendency to think we know the answer and to really be pushing for that answer, and or pushing for that accomplishment or whatever that thing is. And if it's not aligned to where God wants us, it's hard, and you can feel that it's hard, and you just don't get anywhere. So I think my final words would be, don't be afraid to pray about it, and really don't be afraid to ask for help and for a sign, because sometimes that's exactly what we need. And it goes back to that vulnerability you said. We've got to stop being afraid of saying, I don't know what we're supposed to do here, God. I know we're supposed to do something. Can you please help us? And then, do that for a long time, not just once. We know it's not a vending machine. But see if that can't open up something that is help that you weren't expecting.
Yeah. Well, on that hopeful note, unless you've got anything else for our listeners, I think we'll wrap up there. Does that sound okay?
That's great. Thank you so much. It was a delight to be able to do this.
Maggie, thank you so much for your presentation today, for the language around mission and vision and core value. I know it's going to be helpful to the many people listening today. Thank you all for joining us for this, the first of 3 sessions here at our Day of Learning. A reminder that our next session is at 11 o'clock Pacific, 2 o'clock Eastern, and that is considerations in property use, repurposing and partnering. That's with Olanda Carr and Robert Hay. They have kind of helped churches think through various scenarios in really amazing ways. And I'm excited for their presentation, and I hope you will join us at 2 Eastern, 11 o'clock Pacific. Our final presentation today is at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, and that's an overview of understanding finance related to church property. That's with Paul Greer, someone who has worked with, I believe it's close to 1,000 churches around some of the nuts and bolts of property issue related things. A reminder that these sessions are being recorded. You'll receive a link to access the recording on Tuesday of next week. So we'll see you back in just a little bit at 2 o'clock Eastern, and then again at 5:30 Eastern. Thank you so much for joining us.